Thank you for those remarks. It is now my honor to introduce our next speaker. Malcolm Hoenlein is the Executive Vice Chairman and CEO of the Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations, the coordinating body for 53 national Jewish organizations. He received his BA from Temple University and completed his doctoral coursework at the University of Pennsylvania, where he taught international relations and was a Middle East specialist at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. He was the founding executive director of the JCRC of Greater New York and of the Greater New York Conference on Soviet Jewry. Mr. Hoenlein appears regularly in the media, has 3 weekly national radio broadcasts, and has lectured and met leading officials from around the world. He has received numerous awards from U.S. and foreign governments and institutions, including 4 honorary doctorates. Malcolm has been involved in Latin America for a long time and has prioritized the region even when the United States and the Jewish community has not been focused on it. Malcolm has helped push the region to understand the true nature of the Iranian regime and its proxy Hezbollah, ensuring that leaders in the political and Jewish communities understand the threat posed to their security interests. Malcolm has worked to unify the Jewish community in understanding the continuing and increasing threat from anti-Semitism and has been a leader in combating it. We're honored to have Malcolm Hoenlein here with us to provide keynote remarks in commemoration of the attack on the AMIA. Please join me in welcoming Malcolm Hoenlein.
When I got up this morning at 4 o'clock in New York, I felt that I became another victim of the AMIA attack. But when Joseph summons, you don't ask, you just come. In the same way that Joseph responds every time to every request, and he has been a friend and a mentor, and I'm proud to be able to say we work very closely together, and hopefully we have made a difference, and he certainly has been the leader on this issues and related issues. Mr. Cronin, I want to thank the sponsors and everyone who made this possible. The question is, why do we remember? You know, Judaism puts special emphasis on remembrance. It's called Zechirah in Hebrew. The great commandments, the Sabbath, remembering the Exodus, are given in the context of remembrance. But remembrance isn't history. There's no Hebrew word for history. Remembrance is a dynamic process. You have to know what leads up to it, and you have to know what follows from it. It's not as if you're a reporter and say at that place, at that time, an incident took place. You have to know what are the causal factors and what are the results if you're going to recognize them in the future, if you're going to understand how to confront them. For us, history is about the future, because what we do today determines that future. What lessons we learn from the past helps us assure that future generations will have a more secure future. I was asked to talk about why the AMIA bombing remains so salient, why we remember it, why we talk about it. And I had the privilege to visit the site on several occasions, and we are in regular contact with the leaders of the AMIA and DAIA and others in the Jewish community in Argentina. So for us, these remembrances, recalling what happened, reliving it even, is essential because of our obligation to future generations. Winston Churchill once said, the further back you look, the further ahead you will see. Our sages said it 1,000 years earlier. But it is a critical lesson because the secrets of the past are the keys to the future. And only by understanding what really happened can we understand how we can prevent it in the future. Given the rise of anti-Semitism, of Jew hatred, extremism, terrorism, it makes it all the more important that we learn the lessons of the past, and in this case, the incomplete lessons. We learn from the mistakes and the successes, from the good and the evil. We learn the warning signs and recognize patterns. We learn how we must act and react, to hold to account perpetrators and their abettors, those who are directly involved in atrocities and those who support, who fuel, who cover for them, or refuse to take a stand against them. Why has the AMIA attack touched all of us, and so many, so deeply and sustained? The outrage around the world, despite the passage of 2.5 decades and the commemorations that have been held over the recent days. Certainly the magnitude of this barbaric act taking the worst toll of any attack in Latin America. But there was more. The attack was like an open laboratory of terror and hate, where we could see all the moving parts, the components and contributors, the failures before and after, the sabotage by officials and the media distortions, the diversions and cover-ups, all in full view of every open eye. From the top down, the never-ending experiment from which we can and must learn so much. It was a crucible in which the ingredients of death and destruction were mixed as many watched and many were silent. We must assure that no one escapes culpability. No one. Not then, not now, not in the future. The AMIA bombing resonates as it was the end of the age of deniability in Argentina, Latin America, and the world. As the attacks on the synagogues here in Pittsburgh and California were the end of the age of innocence for American Jews and America. No longer could anyone say they didn't know, as so many tried 70 years ago after the Holocaust. 85 martyrs, 11 dead in Pittsburgh. So many others testify to the contrary. By failing to act decisively 25 years ago, we gave Iran and Hezbollah a license to kill, and they have used it against countless innocent people. And they got a pass to incite, to recruit, to organize, to execute. And they did and continue to do so. The AMIA bombing did not give rise to the surge of anti-Semitism that we are witnessing, but it gave it new legitimacy and impetus. For its aftermath, a more blatant, open, virulent campaign with neo-Nazi parties in several countries emerging, and Iran spurned to widespread hate-filled campaigns on the internet. Thousands of anti-Semitic actions and violations. Had the leadership then brought them to justice, maybe it would have been different. This was a pivotal event for Argentinian Jews, for Argentina, for diaspora communities of Jews around the world that saw the murderous anti-Semitism was a reality, and too many again turned a blind eye. Little was learned in the 6 decades by the world. Will they still continue to try to hide behind some false cloak of ignorance, as so many did after 1945? It wasn't that they didn't know, they did not want to know. The AMIA attack was a turning point in the declared ongoing war, centered in Tehran, with other satellite capitals against the Jewish people, the Jewish faith, the Jewish religion, and the Jewish state, and others. It continues to take innocent victims in Israel and around the world. Many thought that Israel was ground zero for actions against Jews, for terrorism and against Jews. But we see that others suffered attacks, but then it seemed always far away, somehow distanced. Even perhaps the attack on the Israeli embassy was treated that way. The devastating sound of the explosion at AMIA brought the message to all. It can happen everywhere, and it is. All the rules changed. The psychology of a community, even of a country, changed. The reaction to the vicious, cowardly terrorism was a tsunami of emotion felt from New York to Jerusalem, from Paris to Miami, everywhere. It became a global event with long-term significance and implications. We see the extent of Iran's malign intent, and we see its extensive reach directly and through its subsidiaries. It shows that all are endangered by such terrorism, especially from a radical extremist regime that has global hegemonic designs and has no moral, legal, or political limits. Human rights, like human life, are mere obstacles for them that are easily dismissed or ignored, even in their own country. All of us have an obligation to help, to continue the pursuit of justice, for the safety of all is at risk when these murderers are at large, especially when some occupy positions of importance and have a government behind them. We have to make sure that we urge everyone to join the battle against Jew hatred and anti-Semitism, against racism in all its forms, against terrorism, and against those who support it, against indifference above all. That is, in fact, the greatest danger that we face. While Jews are often the first victims, we're never the last. We see that in the words of Pastor Niemuller, whose very potent words remind us of it. Jews are often described as the canary in the mine, or the barometer for the conscience of mankind. I, for one, am sick and tired of the memorials for dead Jews, though I appreciate the intent of most. I'm tired of commemorations for Jews who were murdered, for destroyed Jewish communities. I want the world and its leaders to stand up for living Jews, for vibrant Jewish people, and a safe and vital Jewish state. No more crocodile tears, no more hollow pledges. We want to see clear declarations, clear actions, that never again has to become a meaningful pledge, that perpetrators will be held to account, as will their accomplices. Justice must be achieved. There can be no exceptions, no excuses. Before the next anniversary, I pray that many countries will follow the courageous example of President Mauricio Macri and declare Hezbollah a terrorist organization and apply sanctions. There is no exaggerating the importance of this decision, the first in South America, when too many exploit and are exploited by Hezbollah. It is a strong message at home and abroad and must be joined by others. First, by dropping the fictional distinction between a so-called political arm and a military wing of Hezbollah. They are one deadly machine, linked together. They are inextricable and have a leading state sponsor of terrorism in the world standing behind it. I take the threats of Iran seriously. I take the threats of Nasrallah seriously. Dictators tell the truth. Leaders of democracies lie, but dictators tell the truth. And we have to take their words seriously. Hitler told us what he would do. Stalin told us what he would do, but people didn't take it seriously. The words of Khomeini have to be taken seriously. He means it, and he seeks the means to do it. A unified front is essential. We have to stand together across all boundaries, geographic, religious, political, ideological, to ensure that they will ultimately face justice, that they will be put on notice, that we know that words of terror leads to acts of terror, that we will take their threats seriously, that we will act against them preemptively to make sure that they do not become a reality. We salute the announcement by the United States, by the Secretary of State, that the U.S. will provide additional funds, $7 million, to reward, to capture those responsible. It's not that we don't know who they are. Their names are known to all of you and to all of us. We know where they are. And for too long, they have been able to travel, to escape, because countries not willing to act. We know Rafsanjani and Veliati and Rabbani and Vahidi. We know all of them. We know what they look like. We know where they go. And yet there isn't the courage to act against them. And we must, of course, acknowledge a hero of all of this in Mr. Nisman, whom I had the privilege to know and to meet and to host in New York. We remember this true hero in a saga that doesn't have many. And that Albert Nassimi, who paid with his life for his integrity and his unyielding commitment and for his involvement. Is there really a doubt what happened to him? Are we going to continue to let the fiction live? The price he paid for the readiness to expose the collusion of high government officials, law enforcement, judiciary, and others. No, there is no doubt, not in our minds. In 2013, we know Mr. Nassimi's 500-page report, which detailed the Iran terrorist network, would put him on notice and make him a target. These reports go back to events of over 20 years. And 2 years later, he released the results of the investigation, alleging that President Fernandez de Kirchner and Foreign Minister Timmerman conspired to cover up Iran's role and agreed to negotiate immunity and to remove the red notices of Interpol on these Iranian leaders. No, we're not going to hide it anymore. Each of us has an obligation, if we care about the security of our children, of our grandchildren, and of all other children in the world, that there has to be action taken. Interpol has the red cards on them. They have to be exercised, and the governments, they've traveled to more than 20 countries, have to be ready to turn them over. No more excuses, no more exceptions. It is tragic that the families of those killed and those wounded should have been burdened and have suffered so long. Closure is denied to them. I pray, I appeal to all of you to make sure that we act now, as Joseph has done, as we heard from Senator Cruz, as we heard from the Department of Justice. No more excuses, no more exceptions.
Thank you, Malcolm. I'd now like to call up our first panel. I will briefly introduce our panelists. You've already met our first panelist, Joseph Humeyer, Executive Director of the Center for a Secure Free Society. To his left, we have Selena Rialuyo, a professor of practice at the William J. Perry Center for Hemispheric Defense Studies at the National Defense University, where she focuses on U.S. national security, illicit networks, transnational organized crime, counterterrorism, cybersecurity, and anti-money laundering and counter-threat finance issues. As a former U.S. diplomat, international banker with Goldman Sachs, State Department Director of Counterterrorism Finance Programs, consultant and professor at the National Defense, George Washington, and Joint Special Operations Universities, she has 2 decades of international experience in the public, private, and academic sectors. Professor Rialuyo is a regular commentator on global affairs for CNN in Espanol, Foreign Policy, Reuters, and Univision, and has testified before Congress on national security, terrorism, and crime issues. Our third panelist, to her left, is Ilan Berman, Senior Vice President of the American Foreign Policy Council in Washington, D.C. Ilan is an expert on regional security in the Middle East, Central Asia, and the Russian Federation. He's consulted for both the U.S. CIA and Department of Defense and provided assistance on foreign policy and national security issues to a range of governmental agencies and congressional offices. He's been called one of America's leading experts on the Middle East and Iran by CNN. Ilan is a frequent writer and commentator. He's written for the Wall Street Journal, Foreign Affairs, the New York Times, Foreign Policy, Washington Post, and USA Today, among many other publications. Ilan is the editor of 4 books, including Iran's Strategic Penetration of Latin America, which was co-edited with Joseph Humeyer, and the author of 4 others, most recently writing on Iran's Deadly Ambition, the Islamic Republic's Quest for Global Power. And our moderator for this panel is Leah Soibel. Leah has more than a decade of experience on the ground in Israel, the US, and Latin America, working with hundreds of global Latino journalists. In 2012, she founded Fuente Latina, headquartered in Miami with offices in Jerusalem, Madrid, and Los Angeles. Fuente Latina has brought 300 journalists to Israel, facilitated 35,000 accurate TV, radio, and print stories, reaching millions of Latinos worldwide, and their work has resulted in 2 TV Emmy wins and an AP Broadcasting Award. Leia's efforts in Latin America has led to a measurable shift in attitudes towards the world's only Jewish state, and this has helped push back against the anti-Semitic forces promoting false narratives about Israel and the Jewish community. So without further ado, I will now turn this over to Leia to begin our first panel.
Wonderful. Good morning, everybody. I just want to take 10 seconds while I have the moderator's seat to say that it is quite incredible that this event is taking place today. I don't think we really realize the importance of it. It may seem that there are a lot of these types of events that take place on the Hill, but the fact that we are all here today, 1 week after Argentina finally blacklisted Hezbollah as a terrorist organization, given the work of the 3 distinguished panelists here today and many of the partners and individuals in this room, really is quite remarkable. And without much ado, I want to go straight into the questions because we don't have much time. So Joseph, I'm going to start with you. Now that we have Hezbollah designated in Argentina as a terrorist organization, what happens next? And what are the chances that other Latin American countries are now going to follow suit with that?
Okay, so that is really the key question, right? What's the way forward? What happens now? It took a lot to get here, but there's, I think, 3 things that we have to perhaps echo. One is we now have a clear path of how to do this. For a lot of time, Leah, you know this, and I know Selena and Ilan know this as well, that a lot of people in Latin America thought this was impossible, not just because of the political dynamics, but also technical. They didn't have the right legislation, there wasn't the legal framework, and so a lot of people thought technically this wasn't able to do as well. Many countries in Latin America thought that the UN list was sufficient to be able to mirror for their efforts to be able to go after terrorist groups. Hezbollah is not on the UN list. So I think now we have a path, both a political path and we have a technical path of how this is done in Argentina. Now, this is not going to be exactly the same in other countries in Latin America, but I think we have a kind of a roadmap on how to do this. The second thing is in Argentina specifically, and I'll let the representatives of Argentina speak more specifically on this, but I know that they have a registry. It now needs to be populated. Right? They need to put names in the registry. I know that's an ongoing effort. Obviously, there's a lot of Hezbollah facilitators, fixers, financiers that are implicated in the AMIA attack. I imagine many of those will go onto this registry that is now public in Argentina. But I imagine that it's going to be other governments in Latin America and in the world, really, that will help Argentina populate their list with knowledge of individuals and entities that are also operating in their countries that have a connection to Argentina. My understanding of the registry is that it has to have a local connection. It has to have a connection in Argentina to qualify to be on the list, but I know Congressman Petri will clarify all this for us. So I think those are the 2 things. One is we have a roadmap to do this. We have to help Argentina populate their registry so that this gets stronger. And then I'd say finally, and this is, for those that were at the ministerial, I know some people here that were at the ministerial last week in Buenos Aires. It was a very, very proud moment, obviously a historic moment. President Macri reserves a lot of the credit. Though I should say that there are certain governments in Latin America that still do not acknowledge that this is taking place. There are still some governments in Latin America that resist these efforts. Most notable, and it's no secret to anybody in the room, is the government of Venezuela, or the Maduro regime, as we more refer to it in here in Washington, is absolutely not going to play ball with any of this. I think the Morales government in Bolivia is right alongside with it. So there's going to be resistance in pockets of the region that definitely see this as an attack on them because they have networks that they intertwine with Hezbollah and other designated terror groups. So I think we're going to have to figure out a way through that as well. That's not to say that that's impossible, but I think that those countries, in many respects, have become enablers of these kind of networks, not just on the terrorist side, but also on the organized crime side. Hezbollah is well known as a transnational criminal organization, and they launder massive amounts of money. I think some some analysts in Washington have called it the Western Union or the Federal Express for drug cartels in the region. So I think even on that front, I think we'll be able to make some headway. So.
And before I go on to the next panelist, which country do you think is going to be next?
That's a great question, right? I'm the worst at predicting anything, as anyone knows in my stock predictions. So I will I will say this, in the ministerial, the loudest voice, aside from Argentina, and I think the strongest arguments came from Colombia. And I do believe Colombia they're gonna host, I'm understanding, the next ministerial in January of next year, mid-January. And I believe Colombia has very much of the same, obviously not in AMIA didn't happen in Argentina, but they have a lot of the same technical capabilities. They're very professional counterterrorism officials in Colombia, both on the intelligence side, but also on the law enforcement side with their prosecutors and others. So I believe Colombia is a country that could potentially do this. Obviously, it's not going to happen on its own. I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done. But I would look at then the other countries in the tri-border, Paraguay, Brazil. I'd hope that they would assume this challenge as well. I know that they have different obstacles in their countries. There's large Lebanese populations, and obviously not the Lebanese population in itself is not being indicted here. There's a lot of honest and very good and productive contributors to society from those populations. So we have to figure out a way to not target everybody and when you're looking at one group. But Colombia would be my guess. But again, you know my record in the stock market, so.
Thank you, Joseph. So, Selena, let's talk finance for a moment. There are a lot of articles that have actually come out recently saying that recent U.S. sanctions are having significant cash flow repercussions on Hezbollah. Number one, can you address that if it's true or not? And number two, regarding Argentina's designation of Hezbollah as a terrorist organization now, do you see any financial implications?
Sure. So first, I'd like to commend Joseph and his team for putting this event together. We were there on Thursday. It was a very moving experience to be at the AMIA commemoration. I've been following this since 2002. In the fall of 2002, when I was the coordinator for terrorist financing at the State Department, I was sent down to the tri-border to investigate a Vanity Fair piece that said Al-Qaeda had terror training camps in the tri-border. What did I discover? The Lebanese Hezbollah financing and support networks. And that's a major piece because many countries have objected because Hezbollah is technically a political party. They would always couch it in this, it's not an operational zone, it's more for fundraising and for support networks. But without those support networks, these terrorist groups cannot actually realize their nefarious agendas. So we take a look at the financing piece. And the other work that I've been doing is this concept of the convergence of terrorism and crime, and Hezbollah is a clear example, where they take advantage of their tentacles around the world that are involved in criminal networks, as well as the financing piece and the money laundering, particularly in terms of trafficking cocaine. The designation of Hezbollah in Argentina is very important, and now, as Joseph alluded to, we need to start helping them populate with the names of these financiers. As our colleague from the Justice Department, what wasn't touted is that we've actually accomplished several very important extraditions of narcotics traffickers and money launderers who we believe also have ties to financing Hezbollah out of the tri-border. So this idea of naming and shaming them internationally, but we have to bring it to bear much more in terms of impact. First, to identify who the people are, then do the investigations. And this is where, because of the transnational nature, and many of these suspects are dual nationals, how you bring them to justice. And I know that the US government, because I've been involved in this, we're doing a lot of training with the tri-border nations to step up the game in terms of bringing these terrorist financiers and money launderers to justice. Because as was noted before, money is the lifeblood for any terrorist organization. And I was delighted to see in the communique last Friday at the ministerial, there are several chapters that really focus on the role of financial intelligence units, and more importantly, how it has to be a much more active part of how we uncover, but more importantly, pursue not just the terrorists themselves, but those who finance and back them.
Thank you, Selena. And before I continue to Ilan, I just want to say we will be taking some questions from the audience. If you do have any questions, please put them down in the note card that was on your seat and raise your hand and somebody will come by and pick them up and we'll read them here at the end. So Ilan, Iran, the bigger picture. Let's get out of focus a little bit from Latin America and let's take a global view of this. What do you think are really the implications now of the designation in Argentina? Does it have any impact on Iran per se? What has been the feedback from Tehran?
Right. So I think that's a great question, and that's a good place to start in this conversation because you have to know where you were in order to know where you're going.
Exactly.
So as Joseph alluded to in his introductory remarks, he and I have been kicking around the region together for a long time. We started taking trips down there in 2012, and we were trying to essentially answer a very simple question, which is, to what extent had Iran penetrated Latin America as part of a strategy? So remember, historically at the time, Iran was being squeezed by multilateral and US sanctions. Mahmoud Ahmadinejad was the president of Iran. Certainly something resembling persona non grata in diplomatic circles. Iran was beginning to feel the pinch in a pretty substantial way in terms of its economic freedom of action. And so we were seeing all these telltale signs that this was translating into a greater Iranian forward presence in Latin America. The problem was that here in Washington, no one had bothered to go down and look. And so what you had was this scenario where some people said that this was simply fabricated, and some people said that the barbarians were within the gates. And there was really no objective ground truth. So we had this crazy idea that we would go down to places like Bolivia and Ecuador and Colombia and Argentina and so on and so forth, and take a look and see what was happening. And we found out that both sides were wrong, effectively. That Iran did have a strategy in the region, but it was an opportunistic strategy. It was one that was intended to circumvent US and European sanctions and essentially look at permissive financial environments in Latin America to try to sanctions bust. But also that it was beginning in a very real way to leverage relationships on an ideological level with, at that time, Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, with Rafael Correa in Ecuador, with others, to leverage the ALBA bloc, the Bolivarian Alliance of the Americas, in order to essentially create a footprint that it would have, that would be greater than it would have otherwise. And what's useful to remember here is that Iran at the time was talking about coming to our neighborhood because we were in theirs. Right? This was a time when the US was much more heavily involved in, on the ground, boots on the ground in Iraq, and the Iranians sort of made a signal that the Western Hemisphere was not off limits as a result. So fast forward all of this, more than half a decade, and what we're looking at is an Iran that is again feeling the squeeze from an international sanctions campaign. And let's be clear, it's international, right? The Trump administration is leading, the European allies and the Asian allies are balking, but they're slowly but surely they're coming around. And so Iran is increasingly feeling the pinch in much the same way that it was in 2011, 2012. And it stands to reason that Latin America, because not a whole lot has changed in Latin America in terms of financial rigidity, and Selena can talk to that more, but it's still, at least from the Iranian perspective, a permissive environment. There's two things to take away from all this. First of all, that Iran's penetration of Latin America is a long-term project. It was not something that started with Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, although Ahmadinejad and Hugo Chavez had very good personal relations. It was something that Hassan Rouhani, the current Iranian president, has reaffirmed as a strategic goal. And it's also something that becomes more and more attractive to Iran as Iran feels squeezed again in terms of its ability to move around in the international financial system. So while history does not repeat itself, very often history rhymes. And what we're looking at coming down the pike may be a resurgence of Iranian activity in Latin America, the same way that Joseph and I saw it in the beginning of the decade.
Great. Did anybody have any cards?
So as we wait for questions from the audience, I want to maybe add a little bit to what Ilan's saying, because as you mentioned, we have been working on this for quite a long time. Two things. One, Just since we have a large contingent from the diplomatic corps of embassies here with us today, I want to perhaps speak to you. I understand the challenge of this. I've been working it for a very long time, and I want to make sure the public understands the challenge, both the public challenge and also the political challenge. For a long time, the connotation of the word terrorism in Latin America was very different to what we look at terrorism here in Washington. When we think of terrorism, particularly in a post-9/11 era, we think of Islamic terrorism, we think of international terrorism, we think of bombs, we think of non-state actors running around in establishing networks. But in Latin America, for a lot of countries, the connotation of the word terrorism had to do with state terrorism, governments abusing their powers and going after NGOs and civil society groups and violating human rights to be able to use their counterterrorism authorities in a way that actually would pursue civil society. There's periods of military dictatorships in Latin America in the 80s, 70s and 80s, and then there's periods, obviously, of abuse of government power. I don't think we're actually that far from that today. I mean, if you look at countries like Venezuela, I think you see some of that as well. You see the government calling people terrorists, they call political parties terrorist group, and they're fundamentally the opposition elements that are just trying to play a democratic game. So I think that connotation has not gone away. What happened in Argentina was very important. What happened in Argentina was very effective, but that doesn't mean that the Argentine population now thinks that terrorism is 100% their problem or that it's all attributed to international groups, namely Hezbollah or Iran. So I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done on the public education side, on understanding that the public understands that these networks, I mean, just give you a little bit on Hezbollah. We look at Hezbollah and we think, okay, they're doing stuff in Lebanon, they're doing stuff in Syria, now, Yemen, Iraq, in tribe borders, the historic area. But here's what people don't know about Hezbollah. If anyone's familiar with the U.S. Army Green Berets, the Special Forces, right? What do the Special Forces do? They go to other countries and they train surrogate actors. They train indigenous groups. They train folks to fight battles with us, but not directly connected to us. That is the mandate of the U.S. Special Forces community. Hezbollah operates like the Special Forces of Iran, working with the Quds Force. There are groups today in Latin America that have nothing to do with Shia Islam. They have nothing to do with Iran's Islamic revolution. They're groups that were created mostly for domestic reasons and domestic grievances, but have been co-opted by Hezbollah. I'll name a few of these groups. The Quebracho from Argentina, right? The Quebracho from Argentina is not considered an Islamist group by any stretch of the imagination. It's more of a agitprop group that was working to, basically drive a narrative against capitalism and U.S. hegemony and things like that. Well, what would we find out when we knocked into Nisman's wiretaps? What did we find out? They were funded, they were supported, and they were linked to Iran through a gentleman that's now in jail, Fernando Esteche. The etnocaceristas from Peru, the cocaleros from Bolivia, the colectivos from Venezuela. These aren't commonly or prominently known as members of the global jihad or the Islamist terrorist movement, but they are linked. And that goes to what Selena was saying. There is a convergence, and that convergence goes beyond just organized crime and terrorism. That convergence goes into agitprop groups. That convergence goes into nation states. There is a convergence happening because, as they say in the military, amateurs talk strategy, but professionals talk logistics. At the end of the day, the logistical networks that is what brings all these countries, all these actors together. And I think that is what Latin America needs to address, because as they were told us in the past, Elan, we're a logistic hub, right? We're not the target. Well, if you're a logistic hub, then you're not just a logistic hub for Islamist terrorism. You're a logistic for all these negative actors, and there's certain nation states that are helping it. So I think that that's one thing, and one more last point, and I promise I'll shut up. There is a fear, I think, among the folks that know, the credible in the counterterrorism community in Latin America, there is a fear, and I understand it. We were attacked by Hezbollah. I'm a U.S. Marine, and the Marines were one of the first attacks by Hezbollah in 1983. So we get it. As someone said in the ministerial, in Spanish is, no llamemos al diablo, right? Let's not call the devil. Well, the devil's already here. So we have to deal with it. Hezbollah is not Al-Qaeda, is not Daesh, is not going to randomly select targets and just go after terrorist attacks just because they want to create a media narrative. Hezbollah is strategic, they're calculated, they're patient, and they work with Iran. So they the attack in AMIA, they had nothing against Argentina. There was no reason for Hezbollah to attack Argentina. The only reason they attacked Argentina was because Iran told it to do so. And that's all it needs. If Iran wakes up tomorrow and says, I want to attack any country in the Western Hemisphere, Hezbollah will act. And they are prepared and ready to act. We have to be ready to counter that. The point of anti-terrorism is to anticipate these terror actions and neutralize them. It's insufficient to wait for a bomb to go off and say, oh, wow, I told you there was a problem over there. And the only way to do that is to criminalize the action of being a terrorist. If you put a shirt on and it says Hezbollah, you should be prosecuted, at least investigated. And that wasn't the case in Latin America. I think Alon knows there was a store of Al-Qaeda or an internet cafe of Al-Qaeda in Sao Paulo at the time. So I wanted to kind of encapsulate the challenge in Latin America that maybe folks that haven't worked on this issue maybe don't understand. It's not as easy as it sounds, and I fully understand all the connotations of the term and the variances of the interpretations, but it is a serious challenge that I think that we have to assume collectively.
Thank you, Joseph. So we have 8 minutes left, and I'm gonna, actually, I received one card from someone in the audience, and it's a very good question, whoever posed it. I was actually gonna pose the same question. It has taken us so long to get to this point. That's what I was trying to say in my opening remarks, is that we're sitting here and we should be elated that we've come this far, but it's been so frustrating in each of our fields, whether it's educating the public and the media through what I do, and in each of your own fields of expertise, whether it's at the political level, the financial level. It has been really an uphill challenge, despite all of the excellent intelligence and information that's been out there pointing fingers at Hezbollah and Iran all this time. The fact that we've come here and we're sitting here today doesn't mean that when the event's over today, our job is done. We actually have so much more work ahead of us to continue this uphill struggle. The question that was posed is, how do we prevent this lag going forward, as it only allows our adversaries to strengthen while this lag continues? And we've seen that all along. In the decade, more than a decade now, that all of us have been talking about this issue, Iran and Hezbollah have only continued to strengthen their activities in Latin America and elsewhere, and even here in the United States. So if you had one or two messages for the audience and for the cameras, in each of your respective fields, what do you think is the point moving forward that we can't allow to happen anymore based on our past experiences, so that we can push this agenda forward and faster?
Okay, I'll start. Let me try, I'm a little bit of an absent-minded professor, so let me try to sort of narrow this down as neatly as possible. I think there's really three big takeaways here. The first of them is political. Joseph, I think, is absolutely right when he talks about the tendency, the regional political tendency to sit on the sidelines, to not call the devil, to sort of not make provocative actions, right? If you look along the length and breadth of Latin America, what you essentially have is you have three groups. You have groups who are facilitators or enablers, right, for ideological reasons or for infrastructural reasons. You have groups who are observers, right, who don't want to make any sudden moves so that they don't become more attractive as targets or more attractive as points of exploitation. And you have what we used to talk about when we talked about China, we don't so much anymore, responsible stakeholders, or increasingly responsible stakeholders. Countries that are willing to take not only a local, but maybe even a regional role in policing good governance, good corporate practices, and creating a less permissive environment. Our goal, politically, has to be to expand that last group by eating into the middle group and reducing the freedom of action of the first group. And I think that's a hugely important thing that has started now as a result of the Argentine designation, but it certainly doesn't end there. And so that should be our political goal. The second task is administrative. Latin America does not have anything resembling a coherent framework for counterterrorism in the same way that we would think about it in North America. Joseph and I co-edited a book in 2016 called Iran's Strategic Penetration of Latin America, which talked about a lot of these issues. But in the chapter that I wrote, as part of that chapter, I had one of my researchers look at which countries in Latin America and the Caribbean actually had on the books at the time counterterrorism frameworks of the same kind that has existed in the United States since the late 1990s. The answer was, of the 33 countries of Latin America and the Caribbean, less than half. And that's only slightly better now. And so for threat actors, for violent organizations that are looking at permissive environments, Latin America is still very attractive, and we have to reduce that. And the third is we have to be cognizant not just in terms of our weaknesses in the region, but also in terms of potential political changes that could bring dangers to our doorstep. And here, the question that Leah asked me about Iran is, I think, very germane. What we've discovered in other fields, in adjacent fields, fields like cyber warfare, for example, is that Iran is a dynamic actor, that Iran's interests change as a result of the fact that it has an enormously volatile political relationship with the United States and increasingly with the international community. That may make the activities of both Iran itself and its proxies different and challenging in new ways as we move forward. And so it's not enough just to look at the terror threat in Latin America as it exists today. We should also be thinking creatively about how it may evolve in the next several years and how we get ahead of that curve as well.
So I think we're living a very interesting time with an actually alignment in terms of political will to go after Hezbollah as well as other groups which were actually included in the communique last Friday. What I would like to try to take a look is how do we train and change that political will and translate that to actual actions. And I think there are several things that we need to, A, be able to train, and more importantly, keep abreast all of our experts who are in the intel and in law enforcement and the judicial components, not just in the United States, but our counterparts downrange, because we know who these people are. It's a matter of putting together credible cases, and more importantly, sharing intelligence and sharing information, not just within our countries, but across borders, because these are trans-regional actors. And more importantly, we have now, over the last 10 years, deliberately included financial intelligence in all of our law enforcement and criminal investigations. That should not, we should actually double down on that, because the money tells a tale, as opposed to, I would do a lot of work in Mexico where some of our informants disappear or change their tune, but the money and the communications are critical components of any of these cases. How do you bring them to justice? We have to bring these people to justice. Also, because by bringing them to justice, it creates a deterrence for others who will think about being these aiders and abettors. We've always gone against the terrorists, what we call the command and control. What we have to take a look at are these broader structures of supporters who provide safe haven, who promote propaganda, as well as the financiers, and then more importantly, take advantage of a real interesting political time in Latin America now, where many of the countries now share the same goals of promoting security and prosperity in the hemisphere, and particularly are much more aware of what we call external actors, and those external actors include China, Russia, Iran, Hezbollah, and more importantly, change and transform that political will into concrete actions, and now is the time to actually do it.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything that Elon and Selena has said. That's not very unusual, actually, but we tend to agree quite a bit. We work together on these issues. The only thing I'll emphasize or re-emphasize something I said earlier is the public education part of this. There's something one of my favorite economists once said, Milton Friedman, that he said that politicians are like corks in the ocean, right? And the job of civil society is to move the tide. So whichever way the tide goes is kind of, in some ways, the way the politicians go. So with that tide being public sentiment and public opinion. And I think that that's where we're going to probably find our biggest roadblock. We may have political actors that have the political will. We may have training and technical aspects that are happening, which are happening as the Department of Justice mentioned today. Treasury, State, all this. But if the public doesn't get this, if the public in Latin America if this is just too foreign for them, this won't, it may happen, things like in Argentina, but they won't be sustainable. Meaning that a change of government could take place and they could easily remove it if it's an executive decree that doesn't even require to go through the Congress. So I think a public education is going to be a big part of that. How we do that is it has to be a little more creative. I don't think, and I've worked in Latin America a very long time, I don't think running down to the region and saying, look, Hezbollah is everywhere and Iran's going to attack, and an alarmist message won't work. I think we have to be creative in how we explain to them that I think the convergence argument is a strong argument, because it's a technical argument, it's an academic argument. National Defense University has already published 2 books on this with some of the best experts in the U.S., but and some in Latin America. So I think that's a big part of it, using strong arguments that Latin Americans can understand and relate to, and then making them popularized, so that the politicians can absorb these things and translate them in ways that their constituents are concerned about. Organized crime is one of those. I think every government in Latin America has organized crime as one of their top national security concerns. Well, we have news for them. Hezbollah is a major organized crime group. I mean, they are, in some cases, I would say, they operate more as an organized crime than they do as a terrorist group. But just because, if someone comes and robs my house and then kills my brother, that doesn't just mean he robbed my house. That doesn't just mean he's a robber. That means he's also a murderer. So we can't distinguish all those actions. I mean, Hezbollah obviously is an organized crime group. They engage in massive amounts of money laundering, drug trafficking, primarily cocaine trafficking, but they also kill people. And we can never forget that fact. And I think that's the public education side is a big part of it for me. And that's actually, I should say, that's pretty much Leah, your big involvement in, Leah's works she leads this group called Fuente Latina. And so aside from my trips with Ilan to Latin America, I've taken a lot of trips with Leah, more on the public side where she would arrange interviews with a range of media outlets in Spanish mostly in these countries. And my job is just to sit in front of a camera and speak until I can't speak anymore. But that's, I mean, those kind of things, and not just me. I mean, there's plenty of people that we could draw upon, expertise in Europe, in Israel, and here in the United States and in other parts of the region. So thank you for your work as well.
So time has run out, but I will end with what you said, Joseph, is that a lot of the voices over the last decade that have been speaking up about this important issue have been coming from outside of Latin America. And I think it's more important moving forward that we have more organic voices from within the region that are able to speak to each and every one of their target audiences in a vocal and public way to continue educating a broader audience about the threat of Hezbollah and other terrorist and extremist actors in the region. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, panelists. And because this is a media/policy finance panel, we are taking a selfie.
Okay.